A blade. An old man's throat. A room holding its breath. And then, not a scream. Breath. Returning. Greetings, gods. You're in Catheoria now, and this shadow belongs to Medea. The gods started the fire in her. What she did with it afterward, no god ever needed to teach her. Years later, in a city that thought it had forgiven her past, she was still choosing exactly where to carry it. Most retellings remember her for what happened in Corinth, the wedding gift that burned, the silence after. Fewer stay long enough in the years before to notice that Corinth was not a transformation. It was a repetition. The same hands, the same knowledge, a different name on the door. This is a story about a kind of power that does not announce itself as a weapon. It looks, at first, like trust. It looks like the thing you give someone when you love them enough to let them see exactly where you're soft. Somewhere in this story, a man will be cut open and live. Somewhere else, almost the same man will be cut open and die. The difference between those two rooms was never the knife. We're going to follow that difference all the way to Corinth, and we're not going to let you look away once you understand what it actually was. She did not begin as anyone's punishment. Before the ship with 50 oars ever reached the edge of her father's kingdom, Medea was already a finished person, raised in the rites of Hecate, granddaughter of the sun, a woman who had spent her whole life learning which root closes a wound and which one opens a vein for good. In her father's house, that knowledge made her valuable. It did not yet make her dangerous to anyone she loved. She had her own rhythms in that palace, ones that had nothing to do with any stranger's arrival. Mornings tending the herb gardens behind the temple of Hecate, where she alone among the king's children was trusted to walk without supervision. Afternoons with her sister Chalciope, whose sons, by a foreign husband, had given Medea a strange, early window into what it might cost a woman to love someone her own family hadn't chosen for her. She had watched her father rule a kingdom, most of the known world considered half myth itself, a place where dragons could be real, where the sun's own descendants walked around in human bodies, where a woman could hold real religious authority and still be, in every way that mattered to her father, simply his daughter, valuable for what she could be married into rather than for anything she might choose herself. None of that life asked, before the ship arrived, whether she was capable of tearing it apart. It never had reason to. Colchis was not a backwater waiting to be discovered. It was a kingdom with its own gods, its own grief, its own laws about strangers, laws her father, Aeson, enforced without much patience for foreign ships that arrived asking for what wasn't theirs. What the strangers wanted was hanging in a sacred grove, a few miles from the palace, a ram's fleece. Gold enough to look like sunlight had decided to stay in one place. What they didn't have, and could not get on their own, was any way to take it. That is the detail most versions skip past too quickly. The hero did not arrive with everything he needed. He arrived with a ship full of men who were, by their own account, running out of ideas. Jason, son of a king who'd been pushed off his own throne by his uncle, sent on this voyage less as an honor than as a way to get rid of him, had sailed to the edge of the known world to retrieve something he had no realistic way of taking. The bulls that guarded the ploughing ground breathed fire. The teeth of a slain dragon, sown into the earth like seed, grew into armed men by morning. No sword Jason owned would matter against either. Two goddesses noticed the problem before he did. Hera had her own debt to settle, Jason had once carried her, disguised as an old woman, across a flooded river, and she remembered it. Athena agreed with her that the boy deserved to survive his own quest. Neither of them could simply hand him the strength to do it himself. So they went to a third goddess, Aphrodite, and asked her to send her son. Eros found Medea in her sister's chamber. In the middle of an ordinary afternoon, the kind of afternoon a person doesn't remember as a hinge in their life until much later, he fitted an arrow that nobody else in the room could see and put it in her exactly where it would do the most damage. What happened to her after that was not romance. Apollonius, the poet who tells this part of the story in the most detail, doesn't dress it up as anything close to a love song. The arrow, he writes, burned in her like a flame catching dry kindling. Her memory left her. Her face went pale, then flushed, then pale again, in a kind of distraction she had no name for and no defense against. She had not chosen this. In Apollonius's version, this is not treated as a free romantic beginning. A god decided that Jason needed help he could not earn, and a god reached into a young woman's chest and rearranged what she wanted. Without asking her, without warning her, without leaving her any room to decide whether this was a feeling she could trust. It is worth sitting with that for one moment longer than the story usually allows. Everything that follows the betrayals. The blood. The husband who will one day call her dangerous starts here. With a goddess deciding that someone else's quest mattered more than this woman's say in her own heart. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay awake, turning the problem in every direction it would go. And every direction led somewhere unbearable. If she helped the stranger, her father would call it treason. Because it was, if she didn't, she would have to watch a man die for a task that was never really winnable to begin with, and some part of her, newly and violently rearranged, could not survive watching that happen either. She thought about her father's face the day her sister Chalciope had brought home a foreign husband, and the particular silence Aeetes had gone quiet with for a week, afterward not rage. Something colder. The look of a man recalculating exactly how much of his own family still belonged to him. She understood, lying there, that whatever she chose by morning, some version of that silence was now waiting for her too. Apollonius has a phrase for what she felt in that bed, turning toward the wall and back again until morning shame, and a fear she hated herself for. Not the fear of getting caught, the fear of what she was about to become capable of wanting. She got up before her conscience could finish the argument. Through her sister Chalciope, whose own sons had sailed with Jason's crew and needed her protection as much as he did, Medea sent word that she would meet the stranger at the temple of Hecate. Alone, at night. It is easy to read that meeting as the moment she fell in love. It is more accurate to call it the moment she stopped fighting something a god had already decided for her, and started making choices of her own inside of it. At the temple, Jason did what frightened. Desperate men have always done in front of someone with power they need. He praised her. He promised her marriage, a home in his country, a life better than the one she'd have if she stayed loyal to a father who, he didn't bother adding, was about to lose everything because of her. She believed him, or needed to. She gave him a salve pressed from a flower that had grown. The story says, from blood. Prometheus once bled, chained to a mountainside, a plant strong enough to make a man's skin and weapons fireproof for exactly one day. She told him precisely how to survive what was coming. Not vaguely, not as a blessing, as instructions. The way you'd explain a procedure to someone whose life depends on following it correctly. The next morning, Aeson set the terms in front of the whole court. Expecting Jason to fail in front of everyone, yoke 2 bulls that breathed fire hot enough to scorch bronze. Plow a field with them. Then sow it with a dragon's teeth and survive whatever grew from the ground by nightfall. Jason walked out to the bulls, already covered in something he did not make. He did not flinch when the fire touched him, because it couldn't. The crowd watching from the walls saw a man stride toward 2 animals that had burned lesser challengers to bone within seconds, and saw him shrug the flame off his shoulders, the way another man might shrug off rain. He forced the yoke onto 2 animals that had killed lesser men for less provocation, drove the plow in a straight line across ground no mortal had ever broken. That part of the trial took him an afternoon. The next part took longer, and asked more of him. He sowed the dragon's teeth into the furrows the way a man sows wheat, knowing exactly what he was planting. And then he had to wait long enough for the sun to drop, long enough for the court to wonder if the teeth had failed to take, long enough for the first cracks to appear in the soil. What grew out of the ground that evening did not rise gently. The old sources insist on this part. Without softening it, the earth split. And armed men climbed up out of it, already reaching for weapons, already moving, like soldiers who had been having the same war in their dreams for years and had simply been waiting for bodies to fight it in. There is no instruction Medea could have given him for an entire army. There is only the one trick that might thin their numbers before they reached him, and it is worth noticing that this is the moment. More than the fire, more than the plow, where Jason stops being a man surviving a trap and starts becoming someone willing to use one. He threw a single stone into the middle of the crowd. The men, confused about where the attack had come from, turned their blades on whichever neighbor stood closest instead of on him. Apollonius describes what followed. Plainly, they fell on each other the way dogs fall on each other, when a stone lands in the middle of a pack that was already strung tight enough to break. Jason did not stand back and watch them finish the job. When the chaos had thinned their numbers enough, he walked into what was left of it himself, sword out, and ended whatever the stone hadn't already ended. By the time the field went quiet, Jason was standing alone over ground that had, a few hours earlier, belonged to no one's enemy at all, just men grown for a single evening's purpose, with no more say in why they'd had to die than the soil they'd climbed out of. He had needed her for the fire. He had needed her for the teeth. By the time he needed her for the army growing out of the dirt, he was already comfortable enough with killing to finish that part himself, without asking what it meant that the solution had come from her hands and the killing, in the end, had still been his choice. When it was over, Apsyrtus did not keep his word. He had never planned to. He gathered his court that same night to plot how to burn the ship and every man on it before they could leave with anything at all. Medea heard about it before Jason did. She was the one who came to him in the dark with the warning, the one who led him to the sacred grove where the fleece hung, guarded by a serpent old enough to never have slept through a single watch in its life. She sang it down into something close to stillness, not unconscious. The sources are careful to say, just quiet enough, and Jason lifted the fleece off the branch himself. The crew cheered him as they pushed off from the Colchian shore. Someone, somewhere on that ship, was already turning the story of the bulls and the dragon's teeth into the kind of tale men tell about themselves at feasts, a tale where the hero stood alone in the fire and won. The men cheered him, and Medea, standing at the rail behind him, heard her own share of that night start disappearing inside their voices. Medea stood at that rail, having just done the one thing. Her culture had no forgiveness built for handing the keys of her father's kingdom to the man who'd asked for them, and asking for nothing back yet except a promise she had no way to enforce. She did not know yet what she had just become capable of. She would find out by morning. The fleet that followed them was not a metaphor for her father's anger. It was real ships, real soldiers, and real orders to bring his daughter home or not bring her back at all. Aeson had lost the one thing he could not afford to lose in front of his own court, and he was not going to let the insult travel any further than it already had. He sent his fleet up the coast under the command of his son Medea's brother, Apsyrtus, with instructions that left no room for negotiation. This is the part of the story most versions move through quickly, the way you'd skip past a name on a list. He is the brother, a complication on the way to the real plot. Slow down here anyway. What happens to him is the first time anyone in this story discovers exactly what Medea is capable of building out of love, and he discovers it from the inside. In the dark, believing every word she says to him. The Argo could not outrun the Colchian ships forever. The route home was longer and more uncertain than the route out had been. Different sources send the ship down different rivers, around different coastlines, as if even the geography of the getaway refused to settle into one clean version. What stays consistent across all of them is the position the crew found themselves in. By the time the fleet finally closed the distance trapped against a coastline, outnumbered, with a navy ahead of them that knew these waters, and a king behind them, with nothing left to lose by destroying his own daughter, along with the men who'd taken her. There was a conversation on that ship before there was a plan. Some of the Argonauts wanted to fight outright and accept whatever came of it. Others wanted to negotiate, hand back the fleece. Hand back Medea. Beg passage home as men who had simply made a mistake. Jason, by every account that bothers to mention his state of mind at all, was not the one who solved the problem. He was the one waiting to be told what to do, the way he had been waiting since the bulls. Medea was the one who understood, faster than anyone else on that ship, exactly which door was still open. She knew her brother. She knew, better than any stranger could, exactly what would and would not sound like her, what tone, what specific request, what small detail of home he would need to hear before suspicion even had a chance to form. That knowledge was not a weapon yet when she had it. It had been, for her entire life, up to that point, simply what it meant to love someone you'd grown up next to, knowing the precise shape of their trust well enough that you'd never have to ask twice for it. The message that reached him was simple, and it was a lie built entirely out of the truth he already had about her. She told him she wanted to come home. She told him the strangers had taken her against her will, that she would help him recover the fleece if he met her alone, away from his men. On the sacred island, where a temple to Artemis stood, waiting in the dark, nothing in what she said to him required force. It required only that he still loved her the way an older sibling loves a sister he has not yet learned to be suspicious of. He believed her completely. Apsyrtus crossed alone. At night, the way you cross toward family rather than toward a trap. He had no reason yet to treat his sister's voice as a weapon. She was the one person whose word should have meant safety, not danger. In a story that had already become unsafe everywhere else, he likely came prepared to negotiate. to find some version of this, where his sister got to come home and the fleece got returned, and no one's life had to end on that island at all. That is the version he was walking toward when he crossed the water. Jason was waiting at the temple, already hidden, already armed. This detail matters, and the story will not let it slide past unnoticed. Medea did not kill her brother. She opened the door he walked through. Jason is the one who stepped out of the dark and put a sword into him quickly. The old poet says, "The way a butcher drops a bull." Before Apsyrtus had time to understand that the meeting he'd crossed the water for was never going to happen. He had trusted the one voice in this story that he had no instinct left to doubt. That trust is the entire weapon. Not a blade, not a god's arrow. A brother's certainty that his sister would not do this to him, and the fact that she understood exactly how far that certainty would carry him before it broke. What happened after is not something every version softens. In some retellings, even the body becomes part of the escape, grief itself forced to slow the pursuit, so that the Colchian ships had no choice but to stop and gather their prince before they could continue the chase. In Apollonius, the killing alone is already enough, a pollution on the voyage that the gods will not let the crew simply sail away from, a stain that will need its own purification before this ship is allowed to go much further. Either way, the detail survives. Grief did what grief always does to the ones left holding it. It slowed them down, while the people who'd caused it kept moving. The Argo sailed on while a father was left behind with a son he could no longer save. It would be easy and wrong to call this the moment Medea became someone else. She had not stopped being the woman who'd spent a whole night unable to sleep over a smaller betrayal than this one. She simply no longer had a home left to protect by staying careful. Colchis was closed to her the instant she chose the stranger over her father in front of his court. Once the road back is gone, the only doors left open are the ones built out of somebody's trust in you, and she had just learned. Watching her own brother walk toward her voice without hesitation, exactly how wide those doors could swing. She would not forget the lesson. Remember that door. It will open again. Later, in a much quieter room, when two other people who trust her completely are handed something beautiful by her own hand and have no reason yet to be afraid of it. There was a moment, that first night, back on the open water, when she heard something carried on the wind that sounded almost like a voice calling from the shore behind them. Almost certainly nothing. A trick of distance and grief, doing what grief does to the ears of someone who has just done something unforgivable. She did not turn around to check. She told herself, afterward, that there had been nothing behind her worth turning around for. She did not entirely believe it. And she did not let Jason see that she didn't. Jason said little about what he had done at that temple. By the time the ship was moving again, the killing at the temple had already started to harden into something easier to carry. Not a brother's murder, but a necessary cost of getting home. The kind of thing a crew agrees not to discuss too closely once it's behind them. Nobody on that ship asked Medea what it had cost her to write the letter that brought him there. The voyage home did not get easier once Apsyrtus was behind them. The gods who had pushed this whole story into motion were not finished testing the crew that had just bought its survival with a murder at a temple. The ship was driven far off course, dragged bodily across desert sand for 12 days when the sea itself turned impassable, steered past sirens whose song nearly ended what the temple hadn't. Each trial asked something different. Each time, what kept this crew alive was the same thing it had always been, and the men survived long enough to stop counting how many times that had now been true. The trial worth slowing down for came near the end of that stretch. On an island, guarded by something that should not have had a weakness at all, a bronze giant named Talos paced its shore, the living guardian of the harbour, hurling boulders at any ship that tried to land a body that had never been born and could not, by any ordinary measure, be killed, because it had never had anything alive enough inside it to die. The crew saw an unbeatable wall of metal closing, the only safe approach to shore. Medea saw a single seam. Talos had exactly one vulnerable point in his entire bronze body, a vein near his ankle, sealed shut by a single bronze nail. The one place where whatever passed for his life ran close enough to the surface to be reached at all. Nothing about his size or his strength mattered once she knew where to look. She did not need force enough to break bronze. She needed only the patience to find the one place bronze had ever been weak, and the will to go for exactly that point, and nothing else. The giant went down the way anything goes down, once the one thing holding it together is found and removed, not gradually, not nobly, just suddenly absent. The way a body is whole, right up until the instant it figures out it isn't. Remember this island later, not because Talos was bronze, because he had exactly one seam, the one place where something that looks unbreakable from the outside turns out to have been holding itself together with a single point all along. Each trial asked something different of her, and each time, what she gave the crew was the same kind of exact, deliberate competence that had once coated Jason's skin against fire. By the time the coastline of home finally came into view, she had saved this ship and everyone on it more times than anyone on board had publicly acknowledged. And Jason had grown so accustomed to being saved that the saving itself had started to disappear into the background of his own story. The way water disappears into sand. If this is the kind of myth you came here for, the kind that doesn't let anyone, including the people we want to root for, off the hook, stay with us. The part of the story most people remember hasn't even started yet. And by the time it does, you'll already know exactly how this family solves its problems. They did not go home as conquerors. They went home as two people who had just discovered, in the space of a few weeks, precisely what they were each willing to do to survive, and neither of them had said that discovery out loud to the other yet. A blade, an old man's throat, a room holding its breath. You already met this image once, at the very beginning, without knowing what it was. Now you get the rest of it. Iolcus had not been kind in their absence. Jason's uncle, Pelias, the king who had sent him after the fleece in the first place, certain the voyage would kill him, before he ever became a threat to the throne, was still sitting on a crown that had never belonged to him. And Jason's father, Aeson, the rightful king Pelias had pushed aside years earlier, was dying in a back room of his own palace. Too old and too broken to even rise for the homecoming feast being thrown in his son's honor downstairs. Jason had survived bulls that breathed fire. He had no idea what to do about a father running out of time in the next room. So he asked his wife. What Medea offered him was not a vague blessing. It was a procedure, the same kind of precise, deliberate knowledge that had once coated his skin against flame and told him exactly where to throw a single stone among an army. She told him she would not simply pour her own years into his father's veins, the way he first suggested. She said she could do better than that, if Hecate allowed it, though she was careful, even with him, not to promise more than the ritual could actually guarantee. This was not a power she treated lightly. even in front of the one person who had never once asked her what it cost. For 3 nights, she left the palace at the rise of the moon, barefoot, her hair loose, moving through fields and riverbanks, gathering what she needed, roots cut at the exact hour the old methods demanded, water drawn from streams that had never seen the sun, things whose names belonged more to her world than to his. On the first night, she walked alone past the edge of the city, further than any servant was willing to follow, and came back before dawn with herbs nobody else in that household would have recognized. On the second, she built 2 altars in a clearing. She chose for reasons she explained to no one, one to Hecate, one to youth itself, as if youth were a thing with its own temperament that needed to be asked rather than commanded. By the 3rd night, the household had stopped asking what she was doing and started simply waiting to see what she would bring back. She did not explain herself to anyone in the house, and nobody in that house had yet earned the right to ask her to. When she was ready, she sent everyone else out of the room. Aeson lay on a table, an old man with no fight left in him, while the only person in the building capable of giving him back a single year of his life knelt down beside him with a knife. Sit with that for a moment, because the story will not let you skip past it the way most retellings do. She did not hesitate at his throat the way a person hesitates before something she's unsure of. She opened the old blood out of him, drained it the way you'd empty something that had already stopped working, and in its place, she put back a mixture she had spent 3 nights preparing with her own hands, mixed with her own judgment, measured by no one's permission but her own. His skin changed before the blood even finished returning. The white in his beard went dark. The lines a lifetime had carved into his face smoothed out like cloth being unfolded. He sat up a man 40 years younger than he had been an hour before, strong enough, the story says, to wonder if he was dreaming, and strong enough almost immediately to act like he wasn't. This is the part worth holding on to. Longer than the celebration that followed it, nothing about that knife, that blood, or that night was inherently gentle. The tools were the same tools a different story will use for something else entirely. What made this mercy was not the ritual. It was Medea's hand choosing, deliberately, to add the one thing that turned a dying man's open throat into a doorway back into his own life. Jason had waited outside that room for all 3 nights. The way a man waits for news, he has no power to influence. When his father walked out under his own strength for the first time in years, Jason embraced him in the firelight. The 2 of them, laughing the way men laugh when grief has just been cancelled at the last possible moment. He did not ask Medea what the 3 nights had actually required of her. He did not ask what it meant that his wife now carried the knowledge of exactly how to do this twice once to save a life. And, by definition, with the smallest possible adjustment, once to end one. Nobody in that room asked what it had taken out of Medea to stand that close to death and choose, on purpose, not to let it win. She had crossed an ocean for this family. She had opened a door that got her own brother killed for this family. And for one night, at least, what she carried inside her had done something a person could only call love. With nothing held back and nothing withheld. It would not stay that simple for long. Word travels fast in a small kingdom. And a man 40 years younger than he was last week is not the kind of thing a household can keep quiet. Pelias's daughters heard what had happened to Aeson before their own father did. They were not foolish women, and they were not Jason's enemies in any way that should have mattered to what came next. They loved their father the ordinary, uncomplicated way. Daughters love a father who is getting old in front of them and watching someone else's father get his life back, while their own kept slipping further away. Was the kind of unfairness a person doesn't have to be desperate to want fixed. There must have been a conversation among them before they ever approached Medea's sisters in a quiet room, working up the nerve to ask a stranger. Their father had every reason to distrust for something that sounded, on its face, impossible. They would have weighed what they'd heard against what they knew of magic in general, which was mostly fear and rumor. What tipped the balance, in the end, was simpler than any of that. They had watched a man named Aeson walk through the streets of Colchis, looking 40 years younger than he had any right to. And a story like that does not stay a rumor once you've seen the proof of it walking around in daylight. They came to Medea and asked her to do for Pelias what she had done for Aeson. She did not say no, and she did not say yes outright either. What she said was that she would show them first, so they could see for themselves that what she offered was real and not some foreign trick meant to frighten them. She chose an old ram from the king's own flock, a tired, greying animal long past any use to anyone, and led the daughters down to a cauldron set over a low fire. In front of them, she cut the ram's throat the same way she had opened Aeson's, drained its blood the same way, and replaced it with a mixture she measured out herself, in full view, hiding nothing from the two women watching her hands. A lamb climbed out of the cauldron, young, unsteady on legs that had never held weight before, breathing the way a creature breathes when it has just, impossibly, been given a beginning instead of an end. There is no version of this scene where the daughter's hope is unreasonable. They had just watched the proof happen with their own eyes, performed by the same hands that had already done it once. For a family, the whole kingdom had seen the result of. If you had stood where they stood and seen what they saw, you would have believed it too. Some of them likely reached out to touch the new lamb's coat, just to confirm with their own hands what their eyes had already told them was real. So when Medea told them exactly how to do it themselves, the cut, the draining, the timing, every step she had used twice, already they listened the way you listen to someone who has never once given you a reason to check her math. She walked them through it patiently, the way you teach a recipe to someone you wanted to succeed. Nothing in her tone gave them anything to be suspicious of. She taught them the entire procedure. The only thing she did not hand them was the second half of it. That night, in their father's chamber, his daughters did what their own hope had prepared them to do. They opened their father's throat themselves, with their own hands, certain that what came after would be exactly what they had watched happen to the ram. Exactly what had happened to Aeson, because nothing about the cutting itself had looked any different. She did not need to be the first hand on the blade. By then, the belief she had built in them was already doing the work for her. She had taught them everything except the one ingredient that would have made any of it survivable. And trust, once it's been taught a procedure thoroughly enough, doesn't need to be supervised to finish the job. There would have been a moment in that chamber where the daughters were still hopeful, still waiting for the change to begin the way it had begun for the ram, the way it had begun for Aeson, still believing they had done everything correctly because the cutting had gone exactly the way they'd been shown. That waiting is its own kind of horror. The space between doing everything right by your own understanding and discovering that understanding was never complete to begin with. Pelias did not climb out of anything. His daughters had not killed their father because they hated him. They killed him because they loved him. Exactly the amount a person has to love someone to do something that unthinkable, on the strength of nothing but hope and a stranger's instructions, and because the stranger understood, with total precision, how far that kind of hope will carry a person who has already seen it work once. This is the same hand, the same knife, the same 3 nights of preparation, the same quiet authority in the voice giving instructions. Nothing about the method had changed between the room where Aeson lived and the room where Pelias died. The only thing that changed was a single choice, made once, in a fire-lit chamber, by a woman who already understood because her own brother had taught her, without meaning, to exactly how a door built out of someone's trust opens, and how completely it closes behind them once they've walked through it. Pelias was a man who had wronged Jason's family for years, who had sent him on a voyage meant to kill him, who had never once intended to give up a throne he had no right to. None of that changes what his daughters had to live with afterward, or what it cost 2 women who loved their father to discover, in the space of one night, exactly how a kindness can be taught to someone with the last step quietly missing. The crown Jason had sailed across the world for was sitting empty now. Nobody in Colchis was eager to hand it to the man whose wife had just shown an entire household what she was capable of building out of somebody else's hope. A throne won this way does not stay clean just because the man who benefits from it kept his own hands off the knife. She had not needed the daughters to hate their father. That was the part that would stay with her. If anything did not the death itself, which she had chosen with her eyes open, but the particular shape of what she'd used to cause it. Not cruelty, love, aimed precisely, by someone who understood exactly how far it would carry 2 women who had never once given her a reason to be doubted. Jason and Medea left Colchis the way they had left Colchis, without anything they had actually come for, carrying instead the one thing neither of them seemed able to leave behind anymore. They settled in Corinth, and for a long time, nothing happened that needed to be written down. That sentence is doing more work than it looks like it's doing. 10 years passed in this story, and for 10 years, nobody needed Medea's hands for anything except the ordinary work of running a household. It is worth spending a moment inside those 10 years before the story moves past them, because everything that happens next only hurts in proportion to how real this part was. 2 sons were born old enough, by the time this story picks back up, to know the shape of their own street, to run to the door when they heard their father's voice, instead of waiting to be told it was safe. Medea learned the particular rhythms of a city that had taken her in, without demanding to know everything about how she'd arrived, which neighbors nodded at her in the market, which festivals required her presence and which ones didn't, how to be a foreign-born wife in a Greek household without that fact following her into every room. Jason, for his part, stopped sleeping with one ear, listening for a fleet that was never going to come. The man who had once needed a stranger's salve to survive a single afternoon spent a decade not needing saved at all, running a household, raising 2 boys who called him father without any of the complicated history attached to the word, accepted, more or less, as exactly what he presented himself as. A capable man who had once done something remarkable and had since settled into an ordinary life. There must have been mornings, in those 10 years, that looked like nothing more than mornings. A meal prepared without anyone counting what was owed. A son falling asleep against his mother's side before she'd finished telling him why the stars had names. An evening where Jason came home late from some council meeting and Medea didn't ask where he'd been, because there was, for once, Nothing in the asking that needed protecting. There must have been days. 2. When Jason looked at her and did not look like a man, using anything at all, days when he lifted one of their sons, half asleep, off the floor, and carried him to bed with the stunned tenderness of someone who had never quite expected to survive long enough to become ordinary. On those days, Medea could almost let herself believe that what he'd promised her at Hecate's temple, all those years ago, hadn't only been useful to say, it had also, for however long it lasted, been true. It is the only stretch of this entire story where nothing in her had to be measured out, whyhed, or withheld from anyone, where being a wife and a mother in a city that had agreed, however provisionally, to let her be ordinary was simply enough. She had built, against every reasonable expectation, something that looked almost like an ordinary life. Then Jason decided he wanted a different one. It did not happen, as betrayal usually happens in stories no other woman discovered in secret. No confession dragged out of him by suspicion. Jason came to her and told her plainly he intended to marry Glauce, the daughter of Corinth's king. Creon, he framed it, to her face, as something almost generous. A political marriage, a way to secure status and protection for the very sons they'd raised together. A future, he said, that their family could not otherwise afford. He did not deny what she had done for him. He did something quieter and, in its own way, crueler. He recategorized it. The voyage, the fire, the dragon's teeth, the brother dead on a beach, the father pulled back from the edge of death by her own hand. None of it disappeared from his account. It simply stopped counting as anything he owed her. In his telling, the gods had done the difficult work. Aphrodite had saved him on that voyage. He would later say to her face, not the woman standing in front of him. Her part in it had become, in his own retelling of his own life, a detail too inconvenient to keep. Word of the engagement reached Creon, who reached his own conclusion about what a woman with Medea's history might do once she understood what was happening to her. He did not wait to find out. He came to her house himself and ordered her into exile. Her and her sons, before the wedding could even take place, not because she had threatened anyone yet, but because the kingdom had finally noticed that the woman who had helped build their son-in-law's whole legend might also be capable of unbuilding it. She did not meet him with the fury he had clearly braced himself for. She knelt instead, not out of any real submission, but because she had learned, long before she ever set foot in Corinth, exactly what kind of performance a frightened man needs to see before he'll grant a request he already suspects he shouldn't. She told him she understood his fear, that she did not blame him for it, that she asked for nothing except a single day to arrange somewhere for her sons to go before she left a city that no longer wanted her in it. Creon almost refused outright. He told her, plainly, that he knew exactly the kind of mind she had, clever, deliberate, dangerous in the specific way. That cleverness becomes dangerous once it has nothing left to lose. He had heard, he said, what she was capable of. He did not want to discover it firsthand in his own city. It was the stillness in her that convinced him in the end, the practiced, exact calm of a woman who had learned precisely how much grief a king can stand to watch before he starts looking for a reason to feel merciful instead of careful. One day, he told her, no more. Long enough, he assumed, for a mother to pack what little she had left and go quietly. It was not what she needed the day for. And anyone who had followed her this far already understood that when Jason came to her afterward, believing the worst of the conversation was behind them, she did not meet him with the rage he was bracing for. She met him with the same plain, exact account-keeping she had always carried, just spoken out loud for the first time in years. He started where men like Jason always start with the future. He told her this marriage was not about wanting another woman. It was about position, about a king's daughter being able to offer their sons a legitimacy that a foreign sorceress, however devoted, never could in a city like this one. He told her Corinth would never fully trust a household with no roots in it. He told her that if he had real standing here, real family ties to the throne, their sons would never have to live the way the two of them had been living for 10 years, welcome, but never quite safe, never quite from anywhere that would claim them back. She asked him what future he thought he was building that wasn't standing on a foundation she had paid for. He said that was exactly the kind of talk that had gotten her exiled, that a woman who kept score the way she did, out loud, in front of a king who was already frightened of her, was the reason people thought she was dangerous in the first place. He told her, not unkindly, that he was trying to protect her too, that a clean break now, handled correctly, would leave her better off than staying and making enemies of people with the power to hurt her. She told him she did not need protecting from a city. She needed him to say, once, plainly, that he remembered what she had given up to put him in a position to need protecting from anything at all. This is where he said it, not shouted that would have been easier to forgive. In its way, sad, calmly, the way a man explains something he has clearly already convinced himself of, that she gave him too much credit for her own choices. That love had not been her decision in Colchis any more than it had been his. Aphrodite had put that fire in her. The gods had arranged the whole voyage for their own reasons. And if anyone deserved her gratitude, it was the goddess who'd compelled her to feel it, not the man who happened to benefit. He was the one, he reminded her, who had actually walked out to the fire-breathing bulls. He was the one who had picked up the sword. She let that sit in the room for a moment before she answered, because she wanted him to hear exactly how it sounded out loud. She told him that gratitude was an interesting word to use for a love that had cost her a father, a brother she would never see again, and any city on earth she could safely call home. She told him the gods may have started what happened in her chest, but no god had ever once held the knife at Apsyrtus's temple. No god had crossed an ocean with him. No god had stood over his dying father for 3 nights, measuring herbs by hand, choosing deliberately, with nothing compelling her by then but her own will to bring him back. She told him he was welcome to credit Aphrodite for the parts that were convenient to credit her for, and keep the rest, quietly, as his own. He told her she was being unreasonable, that no one could win an argument with someone who refused to let the past stay in the past. She asked him, then, the only question she had actually come into the room to ask whether he remembered her, underneath all of it, as a wife, or as a solution he'd been lucky enough to find at exactly the right moment. He answered too quickly for the answer to be the one he gave. He said both. Of course, both, and the speed of it, told her more than 10 years of careful behavior had managed to. She told him the past was not asking to be let go. It was asking to be remembered accurately, by the one person who owed it that much, and clearly intended never to pay it. He left believing he had won the argument anyway. Men who need to win usually do, in their own retelling. She spent the rest of that day exactly the way the story will let you guess she did. Not packing, measuring. For the first time in 10 years, the house went quiet the old way. Not peaceful, prepared. A stranger arrived in Corinth before she'd finished deciding anything. Aegeus, king of Athens, had stopped in the city on his way home from consulting an oracle about a problem that had no obvious solution. He had no children, nueir, and a god's riddle in his pocket that he didn't understand well enough to act on. He had spent years being told, in temple after temple, the same kind of nothing. Every childless king is told, wait, hope, try again. And he mentioned his trouble to Medea, the way travelers mention their troubles to anyone who happens to be both a stranger by reputation, someone who might actually know something useful. She told him she could help, not vaguely. Specifically, she asked him questions a physician would ask, about timing, about his household, about what the oracle had actually said versus what he'd assumed it meant. The same knowledge that had pulled 40 years off an old man's life. The same hands that knew exactly which root undoes which kind of damage, could undo this kind of absence too. He listened to her the way Aeson once had, the way Apsyrtus once had, the way 2 frightened daughters once had, as someone whose word on this subject had no reason yet to be doubted. In exchange, he swore an oath in front of witnesses to grant her sanctuary in Athens if she ever needed it, a king's protection. Sealed the old way. Impossible for him to take back without insulting the gods he'd sworn it to. There it was again. The cure. The bargain. The door held open for someone who had no reason yet to suspect it. In the same stretch of days where she is preparing to take a future away from one household forever, she is handing one to a complete stranger, using the exact same expertise. For no reason except that he asked and she had it to give. And he had something worth trading for it. The knowledge had never been the danger. It never had been. It was only ever a question of which direction she pointed it. And at whom, and why the same lesson the rest of this story has been teaching you since a brother believed a letter and a man came back to life on a table in Colchis. With Athens secured as somewhere to land, she had what she needed to do, what came next without leaving her sons exposed afterward. She did not plan any of it in total isolation. The women of Corinth neighbors, the ordinary chorus of voices that surrounds any household in any city, had heard enough of what Jason had done to her to take her side instinctively, the way women in any era tend to take the side of a wife replaced for a younger, better connected one, when she told them, in pieces, what she intended. None of them moved to stop her. They had agreed with her grievance before they understood what she meant to do about it. And by the time the shape of her plan was clear, they had already promised her their silence. It is one of the more uncomfortable details. Euripides preserves an entire chorus of women who could have warned Glauce, could have warned Jason, could have warned anyone, and who chose, instead, simply to watch, because the wound Medea was answering felt, to them, like one they recognized. She sent word to Jason that she had been wrong to fight him, that she understood now, thinking it over, that the marriage made sense, that she only wanted her sons to have a place in his new life instead of being cast out alongside her. Could the boys, she asked, bring a gift to Glauce themselves, a gesture of goodwill, so the new wife would not start her marriage believing the old one resented her. Jason, relieved to have his version of events confirmed by the one person who'd been arguing against it, agreed without much suspicion at all. It fit the story he had already decided to tell himself about how reasonable he was being. And reasonable men do not interrogate good news too closely. The gift was a robe and a golden crown, heirlooms from her own grandfather. The son, the kind of thing too beautiful for anyone receiving it to imagine refusing, or to imagine asking too many questions about. Before she handed them to her sons to carry, she worked over the fabric and the gold the way she had worked over the herbs for Aeson 3 nights, running, not rushed, not theatrical, the same careful attention she gave anything she intended to actually work. But this was not the same act wearing a different face. Aeson's blood had been a question about whether her knowledge could still choose mercy. This had stopped being a question about her knowledge at all. It had become a question about whether Jason would be allowed to keep telling the story where he was simply a man who'd once loved a difficult woman and survived her. The boys held the gift in their arms the whole walk to the palace, understanding nothing about what they were carrying, the way Apsyrtus had understood nothing about the meeting he was walking toward, the way 2 frightened daughters had understood nothing about the knife in their own hands. They were not chosen as messengers because Medea didn't care what it would mean for them to be the ones who delivered it. They were chosen because nobody in that palace would think twice about letting a new bride's stepsons carry a gift through the front door. Glauce put the robe on in front of a mirror, delighted, turning to see how the gold caught the light, exactly the way the gift had been built to make her want to. What happened next is not a scene this story needs you to watch in detail to understand. The fire that found her did not come from any torch in the room. Creon, hearing his daughters screaming, ran in and tried to pull the burning robe away from her with his bare hands, and in trying to save her, he became the second person the fire reached that day. Word reached the house soon after that both of them were gone. This part of the story has always been the easiest one to remember and the easiest one to misunderstand. It is tempting to call it the climax. It is not. It is the last thing that happens before the actual climax, the one decision in this entire story that the myth refuses to let anyone, including Medea herself, make easily. She had her sons. She had a guarantee of safety in Athens. She had already taken everything from Jason that a husband can survive losing and still be called alive. She did not yet have the one thing that would make sure he stayed that way alive. And with nothing left, what Euripides gives her, in the hour before she decides, is not madness. It is the opposite of madness. It is clarity sitting across the table from grief. Taking its time, she went to where her sons were sleeping, and she stood in the doorway long enough that the story remembers her standing there at all. This is the first thing worth noticing. She did not look at them and see a plan's final piece. She looked at them and saw exactly what they were, 2 boys who had grown up not knowing any of this, who had never once been told what their mother had given up to make their lives possible, who loved her the uncomplicated way. Children love a parent before the world has had time to explain anything to them. Whatever she was about to decide, she was going to decide it. Looking directly at that, she let herself imagine, for as long as the thought could survive in that room, a version of this where none of what came next happened at all. Athens was real. Aegeus's promise was real. She could take her sons tonight, sail before morning, and let Jason live out the rest of his life, believing he had gotten away with something almost clean, a difficult marriage, a dangerous foreign wife, a story he could tell at dinners for the rest of his life about the woman who'd nearly ruined him and didn't. She could let her children grow up. She could grow old, watching them become men who had no memory of any of this. Men who might never need to know what their mother had done in Colchis, in Iolgus, or in this house. For a moment, that future was close enough to touch. Then she understood what that mercy would actually cost. And the understanding did not arrive like an argument. It arrived like a fact she had been avoiding, the way you avoid a wound you already know is there. If her sons lived, Jason would mourn a bride and a father-in-law for a season, and then he would do what he had always done with grief that wasn't convenient to keep. He would rename it. A difficult chapter, a foreign wife's jealousy that had gone too far but had. In the end, spared what mattered. He would raise her own sons. Eventually, inside a story where she was the villain and he was the man who had survived her. And the two boys in this room would grow up to be the proof he needed that his version was the true one. They were not only what she loved most in the world, they were the last evidence left that could still confirm, for the rest of his life. The story he wanted to tell about himself, a man who had loved a dangerous woman, and come through it, and kept what mattered. Every year that passed, the debt she was owed would shrink a little further inside somebody else's retelling, until it disappeared the way Aphrodite had already, conveniently, absorbed the credit for everything that mattered in Colchis. She heard, clearly, underneath all of that calculation, the part of herself that did not want any of it to be true. It did not whisper. It was not a weak voice losing an argument to a stronger one. It was the loudest thing in that room, and it sounded exactly like a mother, because that is precisely what it was. It said their names. It said the small, ordinary things mothers know about their children that no myth bothers to record. The shape of a sleeping face, and a particular way. One of them held his breath when he dreamed. She did not silence that voice. She did not tell herself it was wrong, or weak, or beneath what she'd become. She let it finish. She knew, even as she let it finish, that nothing it said and nothing she could answer back would ever turn what came next into justice. That was the worst part, and she did not look away from it. The argument did not make the act right. It only made the act hers fully, without a god or a husband or a grief left standing between her and it. And then, having heard the whole argument her own love was capable of making, she answered it anyway. This is the part worth sitting with longer than the act itself. The story does not say she stopped being a mother in that doorway. It says she remained one completely, and chose something else, regardless, which is a far colder fact than any version where grief simply overwhelms her and the choice happens to her instead of through her. Nothing overwhelmed her. She was not swept past the point of feeling. She felt the entire weight of what she loved, named it accurately. One last time, the way she had always named everything accurately, and decided that what Jason had taken from her was worth more than what staying a mother to his sons would cost her. What happened after that? This video will keep outside the frame. Not because the act is unspeakable in the simple sense. Everything in this story has already asked you to look at unspeakable things, but because the version that matters here is not the sound of it. It is the silence that came after, and the fact that nothing in this house would ever again need explaining to anyone. Jason arrived too late to do anything but discover what he could no longer prevent. He did not get to hold his sons. Medea would not allow it. The last door in this story. Finally, closing from her side instead of someone else's, he stood outside his own house. A man who had spent 10 years learning how to describe debts as complications, finding out in one afternoon that some debts collect themselves. What he said to her, and what she said back, is the part of this story that has survived almost word for word, because no playwright since has ever needed to improve on it. He called her a monster. He told her no Greek woman could have done what she had just done, as if the horror of it needed a foreign word to be properly contained. As if the act made more sense the moment it stopped being something a person had chosen and became, instead, something her blood had always been capable of. It was easier, in that moment, to call her foreign than to call her his. She did not flinch from the word. She told him that whatever she was, she had been exactly that, since the night she stood at a temple in Colchis and decided his life mattered more than her father's trust, and that he had been glad enough of what she was then to take everything she offered and ask very few questions about what it had cost her to offer it. He told her she had destroyed him, that whatever grievance she carried, nothing could justify what she had taken from him. She asked him, plainly, what exactly he believed she owed him that he had not already taken first. She named it the way she had named it once already, in the hour before the wedding gift was sent. Except now, there was nothing left to soften it for a father she would never see again. A country closed to her forever. A brother left behind on a shore she could never return to. Because she had chosen, once, to believe a promise. A frightened man made her at a temple at night. A decade spent watching him narrate his own survival in a way that required her contribution to get smaller every time he told it. He told her none of that gave her the right to do what she had done to their sons. She told him he was correct, and that she had known it was true in the doorway of their room, looking at them, before she did it anyway, that she had not been confused about whether it was right. She had simply decided that what he had cost her was no longer a debt. She was willing to let him keep rewriting into something smaller. He had wanted, for 10 years, to be the only one allowed to decide what their shared history meant. She had made sure, finally, that he would never get to finish telling it the way he wanted to. He told her he wished she had never been born. She told him that wish had come 10 years and 2 sons too late to mean anything at all. Above the house, where Jason could see her and could do nothing about it. A chariot sent by her grandfather. The sun came down out of the sky not as a reward. The story is careful never to suggest that, but as the kind of cold, ancient unfairness. The old gods specialized in a world that does not always make the people we want punished actually suffer, and does not always let the people who suffered the most simply disappear into the grief they earned. She climbed in. The dragons pulling it did not look triumphant. They looked like something out of a colder myth than the one everyone had been hoping for, the kind where nobody gets the ending they think they deserve. And the gods, watching from somewhere far enough away not to be implicated, let it happen anyway. Jason was left standing in front of a house that no longer had anyone alive inside it to argue with. He did not die that day. The story does not give him that mercy either. He lived on the way the story insists he must. Inside a version of his own life, he could no longer control the telling of the one man left who had once decided, quietly and repeatedly, that someone else's sacrifices were a complication rather than a debt. He would have to live with what that decision had cost. For as long as the gods decided he had to. The easiest lesson to take from this story is the one that lets you close it like a door that Medea was a monster. That monsters are rare, and that the people you love are not them. The story does not actually let you close the door that easily. If you have been paying attention to what it showed you instead of what it's remembered for. The fire that healed Aeson and the fire that killed Glauce came from the same hand. The brother who walked toward his sister's voice and the daughters who walked toward their father's cure both died for the same reason. Because someone they loved knew exactly how far their love would let them be led. Nobody in this story who suffered did so because a stranger found their weakness. They suffered because someone close enough to know it chose. Once, what to do with what they knew. Medea is remembered as the furthest possible thing from ordinary, but the mechanism underneath her, the fact that the people most capable of helping you are, by definition, the people who know exactly how to hurt you, and that nothing about loving someone removes that capability. It only decides, moment to moment, whether it gets used. That part of the story was never about Colchis at all. The frightening question was never whether someone hates you enough to hurt you. Strangers can hate you. It costs them nothing. And it rarely works. Because they don't know where to aim. The frightening question is whether someone who once knew exactly how to save you might, one day, decide that saving you is no longer what you've earned. What have we handed to the people who love us that only love would ever know how to use against us?